Very simply put, today we are going over the large set of balance tuning and spec changes in the beta of Midnight. Starting with Death Knight, we have the first bad news. Deathbringer has not been given any attention, so it continues to remain shit. The bad news continue, or they are not even bad news, actually they are expected news, because Blood Death Knight has been nerfed. We had aptly timed a video pointing out how OP Blood was, so now it's nerfed. TLDR, Visceral Strength, which we thought used to be just a tooltip error from the War Within, no, it was real. It actually wasn't supposed to give you Bone Shield stacks, and now it doesn't anymore. This is a problem because now you are forced to go back clicking buttons you didn't really want to click. As a simple comparison, this is your Blood Death Knight in Skyreach, back until, a couple of days ago when Skyreach was testable. You see a grand total of 17 Mourarend casts and Death's Caress casts, which likely wasn't even cast to generate Bone Shield charges, but just to pull. And this is the new one in Mizara Caverns from basically today, the new testable dungeons, and Mourarend is back. And so is Death's Caress. Because you need to generate charges again. You don't get them for free by spamming Blood Boil, like you could from your Visceral Strength. But the much bigger nerf is this. Gift of the Sun Lane now only activates from casting Dancing Rune Weapon. This is the problem, or rather, I guess we can say, was the problem, of having a tier set and a Apex talent, which buffed you a lot in the case of the Apex talents, from the fact that now your Dancing Rune Weapons could be spawned by consuming runes for free. And when you consume these runes to spawn these Dancing Rune Weapons, you would get Gift of the Sun Lane as well, which was a ton of haste. It was, what, 21% haste, active for like 70% of the time. And obviously, when Gift of the Sun Lane is active, Vampiric Strike replaces your Heart Strike, which is very good, because on top of doing more damage and everything else, you also get Transfusion. Vampiric Strike increases the damage of your Dancing Rune Weapon by 20%, overlapping, and Boiling Point. The more you can spam Heart Strike and Vampiric Strike, you can empower your next Blood Boil as well. All of this worked really well with Vampiric Strike, which you can also see in the change in the casts. Before, you had a whooping 19 casts per minute of Vampiric Strike. The new version, post-nerf, you go down to 6 casts per minute of Vampiric Strike. So, loss of damage, significant loss of damage of Blood Death Knight. You have a few changes to compensate here and there, like you have melee auto attack damage increased by 150%. You have Bloodshot, not just increasing your physical damage, but now all of your damage is increased by 8%. But your tier set loses 7% Blood Boil damage. Your own Blood Boil is also nerfed by 12%. The chance of Death Strike to give you a free charge of Blood Boil is also nerfed by 10%. So you lost a ton of damage, TLDR, as well as defensiveness, because you're also slower in your global cooldown to press your buttons. So it was an expected set of nerfs for Blood, though. Frost Decay is basically unchanged. You did get a much larger set of changes to Unholy, although so far not really too big of an effect to the value of Unholy before and after these changes. A significant amount of these also were flat increases, so it's not that they're going to change your rotation or the value of your abilities besides their damage. So Soul Reaper doubled in damage, Death Curl, single target spender, more damage, Epidemic, AoE spender, more damage. You did get a few extra value points like Necromancer's Cunning, the extra Putrefy now, summoning a Lesser Ghoul to attack instead, and when your Lesser Ghoul expire, they explode, doing AoE damage, as well as the Magus of the Dead Frostbolts and Shadow Bolts deal increased damage, as well as the Scourge Strike, summoning a Lesser Ghoul. The cooldown of Putrefy is being reduced. These are good, however, it is still very poor in terms of results, because you can still gauge the effectiveness of these changes by how well the specs are doing post change, right? If you look at the results after these changes, right? After these changes, and you look exclusively at Unholy, for example, right? You see that, first of all, nobody still wants to play Unholy. And number two, the numbers. are in the 60k range compared to what the better specs are doing now, which is in the 120, 130k in the large AoE dungeon, and then 90k or so in the smaller pack dungeons. So even with these changes, players are still not very excited about playing Unholy. Now, very few changes to Demon Hunter besides mostly nerfs. You have gotten Thrill of the Fight much more simplified. Now it's a 6% haste buff for 30 seconds, which is very boring. The most relevant change really to Havoc is that your netherwork, your immunity has been removed. So you lost, officially, for now at least, your immunity as a DPS spec in Midnight. For Druid, the biggest changes are to balance. The biggest changes start in your hero talents. So Blizzard now is not even pretending to have Lunar Calling be a choice node talent, because everyone was playing with Lunar Calling anyways. The more relevant change is that now Lunation gives you a slower cooldown to Fury of Elune, and that when you play Keeper, your potent enhancements no longer gives you CDR on your Celestial Alignment, it gives you more haste inside of Celestial Alignment. Now, the statement of intent of Blizzard for balance was, these changes aim to reduce some of the more subtle complexities of Balanced Druid. Whirling Stars and potent enhancements have been updated to remove the cooldown reduction unalignment in them. So this change now put your CA to have a 60-second extra CDR instead of 100. Except you also don't lose the 20% duration of it. What this does is that now you have a 30-second recharge cooldown of Solar Eclipse and a 2-minute Celestial Alignment. So ideally they would line up 30, 60, 90, 120 compared to before, which they were off synced. You also lost the extra 10-second CDR of it, so it makes it easier to line up. You also even reduced the CDR you gain in Elune's Chosen for your Fury of Elune, so it goes down to be a more reasonable 30-second cooldown to further line up with your Eclipse. This is still weird though, because your Treants still have a 45-second cooldown. The only way for you to line this up is if you lose the 15-second CDR to summon 4 of them, so that now this goes to a 1-minute cooldown. So now you have Eclipse plus Treants, only Eclipse, and then again Eclipse plus Treants. One every other use of Eclipse, but it's still going to be offset because you still have this in your talent, you still have Control the Dream, you still have the 15 seconds up of max CDR to the abilities, plus you still have CA, which you don't use with Eclipse. You use Eclipse, wait 15 seconds, and then use CA, or rather the other way around, you use CA, wait 15 seconds, and then use Eclipse. So they still off-sync themselves. This is still on a 45-second cooldown. So this idea of simplifying these cooldowns is a bit weird for Balanced Druid. This is also extremely weird. Global cooldown after activating Solar or Lunar Eclipse is shortened to alpha second instead of the normal 1.5, just for one button. Not for the entire duration or anything, just for some reason they didn't want to make Solar Eclipse or Lunar Eclipse off the GCD, so instead they put it at a 0.5, which is super weird. The rest of the changes are just basic numbers. All spell damage reduced in turn of getting a bunch of your abilities buffed. But the biggest change for balance really was the changing of essentially the timing of your cooldowns. Most of the other changes in here for Druid are just numbers. Melee damage increased for Guardian, just like melee damage has been increased for all tanks, not just Guardian, and some nerfs to Resto Druid. Biggest changes here for Evoker are the nerfs to Augmentation. All damage to Og reduced by 15%. Og was doing good damage. This was the pre-changes, I guess, Mythic Plus meta of groups doing what were high keys. So far you had Priest, Frost Mage, Devastation Evoker, you had Frost DK, BM Hunter, and then you also had Augmentation. It was the other part of the top 5-6 specs in terms of performance. 15% flat nerf, as well as the duplicate value from your tier set, and the tier set now giving you half the extension on your Ebon Mine. So it's just about basically numbers for Augmentation. Preservation gets some slight changes to their Meritra's Blessing Apex talent. Now it reverses 2% damage taken instead of 4. It heals 5 total targets instead of 6, but it is now considered a green spell instead of a bronze spell. This is somewhat of a buff, first because of the I guess the bug where this instant spell was still consuming temporal compression, which was bad. It's good because as a green spell you benefit from the 10% more healing of Lush Growth. You lose the value of tempo charged, bronze healing and absorption increased by 15%, but you're not forced to take this, especially now with Mauritius Blessing no longer benefiting from this. The other change for preservation is the fact that now temporal anomaly absorption is worse in the raid, and in turn you gained more Living Flame and more Verdant Embrace healing. No real change to Hunter besides more of what we saw for Augmentation. They nerfed the better one. They nerfed Beast Mastery, which was the other member of the top performers in the beta. So that's basically all that is. Very large changes for Mage. So all 3 specs. Now the hero talents are whatever. The biggest change to the hero talents for Frostfire is that Frostfire Bolt gets faster haste to its cast time, and Dual Casting Adept now increases shatter damage instead of increasing Ice Lance damage, and we will see why this is important. Spellslinger, as Blizzard says, we are moving the Augury Bonds buff effects to Splinterstorm itself, and Augury Bonds has been redesigned to provide a new source of splinter generation. The result here is that Augury Bonds conjuring a splinter has a 15% chance to conjure a second one. Meanwhile, the buff, or rather the change, is that during your cooldown, so Arcane Surge or Ray of Frost, you conjure instantly 8 splinters, or 1 splinter per channel, like during the tick of the channel of Ray of Frost until 8. And then for 10 seconds after Ray of Frost or doing Arcane Surge, you conjure double splinters. Now, what is relevant about Mage is that right now, the only playable one, according to Mages, was Frost. Fire was not really liked at all, and Arcane was actively disliked. If you look at the top results in keys, it's just Frost. Nobody wanted to play Arcane, you know, these numbers for Frost, and then you check these very same numbers for Arcane. Yeah, doesn't look good. So the change for Arcane is much more simple. It's just flat out damage. 20% buff to all of your abilities and 40% buff to Arcane Barrage. The other very big change is this. Overpowered missiles has been made even stronger now, because now you also have, on top of the 15% chance whenever you gain clear casting to double the damage of Arcane missiles and make it hit 4 targets, now you also cause it to generate maximum stacks of Arcane Salvo. So to generate 20 stacks in one proc, which is also 60% more Arcane Barrage damage. That's the extra given to overpowered missiles on top of all of this damage buff. For Fire, amongst all of this, the only thing that matters is Meteor is underperforming, so we're giving it a bump in damage, but more importantly, Scorch has returned and is now available below Ignition. That is the important part for Fire. Blizzard has given up on trying to get rid of Scorch. Scorch is obviously back with all of its functionalities. Castable while moving, doing execute is a guaranteed crit. You can also take Scald now to make it do 250% more damage doing execute. All of these buffs to Scorch are back. As well as, in terms of smoothness of play, Fireball base cast time is now 0.5, half a second faster. So, you know, in terms of results right now, you go from a reasonably dull rotation back to few buttons to at the very least pretend you have a few more, because now you can also include Scorch in your rotation again, and also something slightly more interactive in your downtime rotation. So while Combustion is not active, damage from Ignite has a small chance to make your next Scorch instant, deal double damage, and deal damage as though your target is below execute range. So also do 250% increased damage from Scorch. So basically that's the whole news of Fire. More Meteor damage, and Scorch is back as part of your toolkit. The bigger change though goes to Frost. As Blizzard points out, we have received a lot of feedback that target swapping and debuff tracking can feel overwhelming in AoE. Not mentioned here because our nameplates are shit. So we are taking a bigger swing at focusing Frost, Freezing, and Shattering gameplay to your primary target. So, in case you're not aware, your mastery or a subsection of your mastery makes your flurry, and your frostbolt or frostfirebolt apply stacks of shatter. Your ice lance can break multiple stacks of shatter to do extra damage based on the amount of stacks you're breaking, and then of course you have chances to freeze targets, which you can then target to do extra damage if the target is freezing, as well as base passives like Fingers of Frost to give you damage to shatter targets. Now, the main change now, compared to where it was before, this is the old Frost Mage, the old Frost Mage of 2 days ago, so pre-change, and this is the new Frost Mage, right? What is visible is that before, Shatter was just an extra thing you spent a talent on, you gained 4% of your damage, cool, I'll take it. Now, this is Shatter. So, the TLDR is Blizzard came up with multiple ways for you to shatter way more stacks than before, and also not require nearly as much micromanagement of targeting different mobs in a 10 target pool because they had shatter on them. Now it's easier for you to cast abilities that essentially smart target or just AoE target those shatter stacks and break them. If you go to the new updated Mage, for example, and type in shatter, this is what you get. Besides the Apex talent, which doesn't actually synergize with Shatter, it just gives you your Hand of Frost procs from Shatter. But Shatter itself, you already had your Fingers of Frost causing your Ice Lance to shatter damage equal to 4 stacks, right? And Frostbite for freezing. Now you have Frozen Orb, increasing the Shatter's damage by 10% for its duration. You can take Whiteout to further reduce the cooldown of Frozen Orb for each stacks of Freezing Shatter. You can take Deep Shatter to get the 50% critical strike damage based on your critical strike chance, more chance, base crit chance of your Shatter. You can take Art of Ice for Ice Lance to shatter 1 additional stack of Freezing. You have Freezing Winds to make shattering enemies inside Blizzard make Shatter AoE deal 15% more damage. Thermal Void makes consuming Brain Freeze give your next Ice Lance 4 extra stacks of Shatter to consume. When Ice Lance shatters a stack of Freezing, the cooldown of Ray of Frost is reduced. Comet Storm has, obviously, each Comet shatters 2 stacks of Freezing. So more AoE, I guess, free target Shatter breaking in Mythic Plus pools, for example. As well as Glacial Spike no longer applying Freezing. Instead, it shatters 5 stacks of Freezing. So all of this is what you get from this. All of these changes themed around giving you a much higher shatter value, which is also much more automated. Less micro maintenance required to now benefit from shatter. This also comes with the flat out 25% buff to the damage of shatter and your tier set, having Flurry, having a 10% chance to grant Fingers of Frost, which can be used to shatter stacks, and then your 4-piece, Fingers of Frost increases shatter damage now by 15% instead of 10. So the TLDR, basically as a whole of Frost, is way more shatter damage, way more shatter value now, which is not seemingly reducing their value, their damage value, since you still see a whole bunch of Frost Mages in their good results even a couple of days into these changes in the beta. Now the major change for Brewmaster is damage. The whole bring me another like brew and the empty barrels. The main change here is the damage increase, the empty the cellar's damage increase, mostly because Prot Warrior and Brewmaster were the lowest damage dealing tanks, and as we will see down below in a bit, Prot Warrior's damage has been nearly doubled, so he would have left Brewmaster as the lowest damage dealer by a bit, so more damage buffs to Brewmaster Monk. The most relevant change to Paladin is the Holy Shock cooldown going from 7.5 down to 6 seconds. That's the biggest change. Priest gets changes to both Discipline and Shadow. So the changes of Discipline, you have a whole bunch of them which are flat numbers which you can just ignore, like Mind Blast damage, Atonement healing for less, then you have Smite buff, healing from Flesh Heal is being increased, Power Radiance healing has been reduced, Mindbender damage has been doubled. The main changes though are obviously to the talents. In terms of talents, you have a few additions and a few extras. Now you have an entire shadow line of talents with the returning Shadow Fiend. Shadow Fiend is now a proc from your Shadow Word Death at a 40% chance, but then you can take Death's Torment to make Shadow Word Death double hit for a total of 3 hits. So this one becomes basically a guaranteed, followed by Expiation. Now it consumes only 1 second of Shadow Word Pain instead of 3, and it deals 300% of the dots damage instead of 200%, which is still garbage. Absolutely garbage. It's even weaker than before, because before it was 3 seconds. This is still terrible. And then Inescapable Torment, the extension of your Shadow Fiend or your Mind Bender. You have an extra follow-up of Evangelism, either a 15% extra healing or a Mind Bender. In general, though, these are still mostly disappointing, like the 30% damage over time of Penance or the 30% more damage of Smite on a 2-second buff, meaning you have to keep spamming Smite to keep this buff up. Overall, most of these changes are disappointing and boring. It's still a strong spec for content in dungeons compared to the raid. The raid is still much weaker. Evangelism has been completely butchered compared to what it was before. The previous version of Evangelism was instant Radiance at 200% effectiveness, and then no cooldown to Radiance at 40 reduced mana cost for 8 seconds. Now, the effectiveness of the instacast is 150% instead of 200, and you don't have a free spam of Radiance. It's your next 2 Radiances are going to be instacast instead. So just a much poorer Evangelism in raid content. In Mythic Plus is still fine. Same goes for a bunch of these effects in Mythic Plus are still very good. The Void Shield power is still more than fine. The entire thing which Discipline kept to be meta in Season 2, the whole Wheel and Woe into barrier, strong power shields are still there, even though nowhere near as powerful as they were in Season 2. It's just weaker in raid content. Shadow Priest is nerfed. Shadow Priest was part of the gang of top damage dealers up before these changes, and even after these changes, by the way, it's not the Shadow Priest has gotten that much more terrible. They're still doing fine, but less than what they were doing before these changes. Their target was the insanity generation, so you have things like Shadow Fiends and pets generating less insanity. You have your tendrils, your void tendrils from the Idol of Cthulhu, lasting less and generating less insanity over their duration. Tormented Spirits having a 40% reduced chance to trigger, which is a major nerf because this was your Shadowy Apparitions proc from Shadow War Pain, which was obviously great in Mythic Plus when you could target 10 mobs with Shadow War Pain ticking, so way more spawns of Shadowy Apparitions, which also means more insanity, of course. And then flat nerfs. Devouring Plague, your new Devouring Plague, nerfed by 30%, and Shadowy Apparitions themselves nerfed by 30% in damage, on top of your insanity generation being nerfed. This is obviously quite nasty for Shadow, because this flat nerfed by 30%, this and this, the same thing, are also nerfed by 30%. Psychic Link takes damage from Madness, so this 30% nerf will also impact this. The proc rate of these has also been nerfed, so these will also be doing less damage because they proc fewer times, and you will also have less insanity in general, so less insanity to cast this one. So all in all, it's like a well over 15-ish% damage nerf to Shadow Priest based on all of these changes. Talking about confusing changes, Rogue is getting nerfed all over the place. You have Hunt and Down damage for Deathstalker nerfed, Tails Fatebound nerfed by 20%, you have Nimble Flurry mega nerfed. Now your Splash AoE damage only affects auto attacks, Unseen Blade and Coup de Grace for Trickster instead of your actually damaging abilities, plus 16% damage nerf to Assassination, 20% auto attack nerf. You have Outlaw reduced in damage by 16%, you have Sub losing 9.5% damage to Black Powder and 8.5% damage to Secret Technique. This is very weird because none of this is particularly touching the mechanics of the specs. The way the specs play is just flat out damage, which means that when Blizzard looked at Assassination, they said, we see nothing wrong with Assassination other than the amount of damage they are doing. However, when you check the amount of damage Assassination was doing, even just the entirety of Rogue, but Assassination, their damage was much reduced compared to the top specs. Even if you look at the keys that the tryhards were playing Assassination, you see 10 to 16, 10 to 14, 10 to 15, and then you look at the actual top keys of the good specs, and it's 20 to 19, it's 20 to 18, it's 18 to 17. So these specs were 4 to 5 key levels above Assassination. And yet Blizzard looked at Assassination and thought, just nerf them. And this goes for all 3 specs of Rogue. It's a pretty weird set of changes to Rogue. Restore Shaman gets nerfed in healing. All Ancestor healing is being reduced for Farseer. For Totemic you have, again, more nerfs. Elemental gets a desperate attempt to making their elementals worth anything. You get nerfed in the value of Lava Burst and nerfed in the value of Elemental Overload at the change, at the compensation of getting all of your elementals buffed in damage, because of how shitty all of the elementals of Elemental are right now. Even though you have to commit 1 talent and then 2 talents and then 3 talents and then 4 talents and then 5 talent points to fully power up your elementals. They were doing shit damage. So let's see if this will make them slightly more valuable to use. Now Warlock gets nerfed, not much else to say. Diabolist gets nerfed, in particular in their free AoE damage. Hellcaller gets nerfed in all of that it's worth, which is Wither damage, nerfed by 35%. Affliction gets slightly different value to their main cooldown, Darkglare. So Darkglare now gets 80% more damage, but they lose the shadow damage increased by 45% for every damage over time effect. Now the damage increase is only 10% per damage over time effect. As Blizzard says, we don't want you to use your brain when you use Darkglare. We don't want you to stock up on dots or pool your resources. Just click Darkglare. We are putting most of the damage on Darkglare itself rather than on the dots that you have prepared on the target, etc, etc. Just base Darkglare damage. Also, follow-up talent for Darkglare, Eyebeam, which has now been significantly buffed. Eyebeam now jumps up to 4 additional targets, 4 more damage. So an even more value of Darkglare in AoE with this talent. Continued nerfs. Unstable Affliction damage nerfed again by 25%. Unstable Affliction was already nerfed by 75% a couple of weeks ago. Now it's been nerfed by an extra 25%. And 40% Agony damage nerf. This is perhaps the more confusing one, because if you look at the damage, even in the largest target count mass AoE dungeon so far that was being tested, Affliction wasn't there. If you even saw a Warlock, it was Destruction Warlocks, not Affliction. So it was interesting to see these severe nerfs to Affliction to this extent so far in the beta. Demo gets buffed, as they were in the more or less the opposite direction of Affliction. So Doom damage buffs, and then Doomguard, Hand of Gul'dan, Wild Imp, Felguard, Fel Ravager, Implord, all buffed, because their damage was, kinda shit. Destro has been nerfed by default because they lost 35% damage to Chaos Bolt, 35% damage to Conflagrate, and 25% damage to Incinerate. The talents they gained are positive. The extra talent to reduce the cooldown of Summon Infernal, your new Devastation talent to give you up to 6% free crit, your Avatar of Destruction being redesigned so that now casting Soulfire is what summons an Overfiend, and putting back your Dimensional Rifts to be passive. The talents themselves are positive, but the base changes for Destro right now are a nerf. Changes to Warrior, significant damage increases here and there, but more importantly, QOLs. Javelineer is back to giving you a silence. Shattering Throw and Wrecking Throw now give you back your 3-second silence, so utility for Warrior Thunderclap damage increased by 100% and initial rend damage being increased as well. However, most of these changes are still bad because what we complained when we talked about Warrior is still here. The fact that all of these talents are mandatory, and now they replaced Last Stand, which was a pseudo-defensive, for another mandatory talent, because you want the 3% critical strike damage or the defensive stance buff, and you can't even get it because you have too many points to spend here. As of right now, in terms of mandatory picks, because they give you essentially extra value in terms of damage increases, for example, you would have all of these, pretty much, and that's it. You have no talent points left. So even adding this extra is already a waste because you kept too many of these, too many points to spend that you don't have to then spend them in the rest of your general tree. The problem is still there. Arms has been significantly improved off of something we asked of Blizzard. Master of Warfare no longer triggering from Overpower. We thought triggering from Mortal Strike would have been good enough. Blizzard went even beyond. Now it triggers from all of your single target abilities. So great QOL improvement to Arms Warrior, and then a whole nasty damage increase because it was doing little damage. Fury gets a similar treatment, however this is seen, Apex Talents Rampaging Berserker has been changed for the 15th time. The pros of this is that now you are no longer stressed about having to extend the Berserk buff to try to make it last until you enter your next Recklessness, so you get a whole bunch of discounted rampages to get more strength buffs, and then you have to try to keep it running, stick to the enemy, have a high uptime so you don't fall off of this buff, so that when you enter your next Recklessness you have a big Berserk strength number. This is gone, because now all of these Berserk strength increase stacks overlap. They don't refresh the buff. They don't refresh the duration. Now the duration is fixed, and the best you can do is get as much strength stacks overlapping before the duration ends. That's it. The third talent point makes it last 50% longer. This is really scummy by Blizzard, because the original duration of this buff was 12. So they nerfed it down to 8, and then they put the 50% buff on the third talent row to make it look like it's a good thing, but no, it makes it go back to 12 seconds like it was before in the first place. But the bad thing of this change is that now this is completely brain dead. Now you click Recklessness, you gain Berserk for 12 seconds and stacking strength throughout those 12 seconds, while your rampage is discounted by 30. And at the end of those 12 seconds, all of this is gone. So you traded having more interaction outside of your big cooldown to keep up these buffs before you entered your big cooldown again, for having nothing now. Now your rotation is even more streamlined and boring outside of your Recklessness because of this change, which however does still make the spec more easy to play in all kinds of situations in Mythic Plus especially, or in a raid. The last bit of changes is to Prot. Already had gotten a whole bunch of Thunderclap damage, and now everything else is increased by twice as much. Practically your entire toolkit is doubled. We touched on this a few times already. Tank damage, just like we mentioned Blood Decay damage being nerfed because of this, and also slightly damage increase to Brewmaster because of this. Prot was by far the weakest one, so literally doubling the damage was still going to put them at the basically lowest damage tank anyways. That's how little they were doing. So that's the last of the spec changes, addressing the very little damage that Protection Warrior was doing. So with this out of the way on this Thursday, this was the entire list of spec changes in this new build of the beta of Midnight. Of course, we're still far away from seeing any kind of reasonable, believable, possible power level of specs before the expansion comes out. What was more important and more relevant right now was seeing any kind of positive mechanical, rotational, philosophical changes of some of the specs into the beta. So for today, on this Thursday, this is all we have to point out. With this out of the way, we are now going to leave each other. We're going to start our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, this was a bit too long. We should have shrunk it down.